The Edmonton Oilers signed veteran free agent defenseman John Klingberg, who is working his way back from double hip resurfacing surgery. We're going to talk all about it on today's special bonus edition of Locked On Oilers.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this bonus edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. I want to thank everyone who's making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's show, very straightforward. We're going to talk John Klingberg, what he brings to the table, why the Oilers would do this, and why it makes sense. So, at the outset, let's start with the big question mark. The last we saw of John Klingberg, he couldn't make it 2 months into last NHL season. Played a handful of games for the Toronto Maple Leafs last year, and the discomfort he was suffering from his lower body injury ultimately pulled him out of those games he was playing in, and he opted for the double hip resurfacing surgery, which only a handful of NHL players have ever pursued. This brings a lot of questions, naturally. There are a handful of players who have undergone said procedure and continued NHL careers, but this is one of those cases where relatively modern science, relatively new procedure, and professional athletes are especially weary of their bodies. We talk a lot about what the Jack Eichel neck situation in Buffalo ultimately ended up meaning in terms of players' rights, where the team wanted him to rehab, he wanted to get the disc replacement surgery, and what that meant. And as we move further and further into the future, the hope would be that medicine continues to advance to enable players to continue pursuing professional careers. You think about the players who are in the NHL right now who have undergone this procedure. Patrick Kane, who's a year and a half removed. He came into the season late last year for Detroit, playing this full season. Jesse Puljujärvi, who is hanging around as a bottom six forward for the Penguins. And then Nick Backstrom, who has tried on more than one occasion to ramp back up to come back to playing for the Washington Capitals, and it hasn't particularly worked out for him. And then Ed Jovanovski, who had this procedure more than 10 years ago and was really the first guy to pursue it. But this procedure is particularly difficult because instead of replacing your hip, and you cannot play contact professional sports with an artificial hip. I mean, this has been the issue dating back to when Bo Jackson injured his hip back in the 80s, and you can't play contact sports with an artificial hip. It is not a feasible path forward. And this procedure, the way it works, from what I understand, what I read in Chris Johnston's article in The Athletic, where there's scar tissue on your hip where the pain stems from, the doctors are going to shave that down a little bit, and they're going to insert a metal ball for you to get your leg reinserted into, basically. They are going to connect those two parts with metal and bone, and based on that, you're going to start working your way back. And this is a long-term process. This is not just, okay, I need to get back to shape. This is, I need to learn how to walk again. This is, I need to learn how my body feels. This means I need to learn how to skate again. And this is a very daunting and challenging recovery process. There are plenty of people who would have been in John Klingberg's position last year and said, give me the hip replacement. I'm done playing professional hockey. I've accomplished a lot. I've had a really solid NHL career. I've made very decent money. But one of the things that I really admire about professional sports, this is something I was talking about the other day with one of my friends about professional wrestling, and obviously, the degrees of physical demand are different for a professional wrestler versus a professional hockey player. But innately, one of the things that keeps professional wrestlers in the game, staying wrestling through their late 30s, their 40s, and in some cases their 50s, and even in some cases their 60s, is that innate desire to want to prove yourself, that you still have something left to give. Because a lot of people, like I just said, A lot of people would have been in John Klingberg's position last year after that audition, moonlight, whatever word you want to use with the Maple Leafs didn't pan out because he was in so much discomfort and he wasn't playing well, and would have said, okay, that's it for me. I've played 630 career NHL games. I've had a couple of top fives for some awards. I've had a really solid NHL career. I played in the Stanley Cup final in 2020. I've accomplished a lot. I am ready to move on to the next chapter of my life. But Klingberg, as a competitor, as a professional athlete, still feels like he has something left to give. At 32 years old, he is not what you would classify as ancient in NHL terms, but he's on the back nine. There is a very defined and straightforward path here, and we'll talk more about that in the next segment and in our final segment. But at his best, John Klingberg is one of the most underrated players of that post-2013 lockout window because he was never the biggest star. He never had a Norris trophy. He never finished top 3 in the Norris. Never really had that signature season, was never the driving force on a great team where even if he didn't individually have as much talent as some of his contemporaries like Shea Weber or PK Subban, he still would have been able to say, well, he was one of the best players on a team that did X, Y, and Z. And the idea here is that Klingberg was not a physical player to begin with. The idea here is that Klingberg is going to be able to ramp himself back up. He's going to come into this lineup for the Oilers, and the Oilers are going to see how it goes. Like I said before, you are coming back from major reconstructive surgery where you have to relearn basically everything about your body to be able to pursue a normal day-to-day life, let alone being a professional athlete. And lest we forget, being a professional athlete is not a normal life. The rigor, the demands, and frankly, the lack of recovery are going to be a challenge when you are dealing with major corrective surgery that's fixing how you walk, how you move. It's really hard to understand or know how everyone's going to take it. You know, we talked about the examples in the NHL. Patrick Kane was okay last year. He definitely said he was feeling less pain and was in less discomfort, so he was able to play a little bit more. He's definitely not playing as well this season, a year removed from said injury, but the Red Wings are heating up. He's been a little bit better as of late, so that's worth monitoring. Jesse Puljujarvi is never going to be what he was supposed to be based on where he was picked, as we Oilers fans know, but he is a solid NHL player. He's still an okay skater. He's still got size. Nick Backstrom is a bit more of a depressing, sad case, if you will, because he should be riding shotgun right now with Ovechkin as Ovechkin tries to break the goal scoring record. You know, prior to Backstrom's hip injury, I would have said he was a lock for the Hall of Fame based on the pace his stats were on. But based on how the last 4 years, I struggle to see how he's going to end up breaking through that ceiling. And then Ed Jovanovski played a season and a half where he didn't really play a ton of games in either of those seasons after this surgery. So everyone is different. That's the last thought I want to leave you off with here. Everyone's physiology is different. How you react to corrective surgery, how your rehab goes, how your body adapts to that new feeling. It's going to be a process. You know, Klingberg is going to have to monitor that, and the Oilers are going to have to be on top of that. So we're going to take our first break of today's show. When we come back, we're going to talk about what this means for the Oilers lineup. Coming up next on today's edition of Locked On Oilers, so be sure to stick around. From the first whistle to the final drive, FanDuel makes the NFL playoffs even more exciting because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win your first bet. That's $300 to keep the action going. The FanDuel app is easy to navigate with a variety of bets to keep every game exciting. You guys know the drill. It's the divisional round. This is my favorite weekend of the year. The Houston Texans going to Kansas City to play the Chiefs. The Chiefs are 8.5-point favorites. Saturday night, Jaden Daniels and the Commanders. First franchise playoff win in like 20 years, going to Detroit to take on the Super Bowl favorite Lions, who are 9.5-point favorites. Then Sunday afternoon, Matthew Stafford and the Rams heading to Philly to take on the Eagles, where the Eagles are 6.5-point favorites. And then Sunday night, game of the year potential, number one contenders match. the 2 MVP co-favorites, Josh Allen and the Bills, Lamar Jackson and the Ravens. Lamar and the Ravens are 1.5-point road favorites. Visit FanDuel.com or download the app and get started with $300 in bonus bets. It's FanDuel.com. Make this playoff season unforgettable with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this bonus Friday edition of Locked On Oilers, where we are discussing the Oilers signing of veteran free agent defenseman John Klingberg. And for the Oilers, we knew before we dropped the puck for the first practice of the preseason that this team needed another defenseman. Coming into the season, the Oilers were looking at I. Emberson, who had 30 career NHL games, Troy Stecher, who had never been a top 4 defenseman on a good team, and Josh Brown, who fringe NHLer, arguably not an NHLer. They looked at those 3 guys and said, well, this probably isn't safe enough. We should get another guy in here. And that's how you ended up with Travis Dermott. Travis Dermott earned his PTO. Travis Dermott earned a contract off of his PTO. He played reasonably well in the 8 NHL games he played. He played well enough in the preseason to warrant the consideration. And he's on a team right now. The Wild picked him up off of waivers. Dermott is somebody who is filling in for a very depleted Wild defense. We talked about it the other night. No Brock Faber, no Jared Spurgeon, no Jonas Brodin. They needed bodies, and Travis Dermott is exactly the type of guy you want to pull in as your 7th or 8th D, because that means you have a reasonably talented group. And the Oilers defense has been pretty solid ever since this turnaround started back in mid-November. You know, Bob Stauffer keeps referencing November 23rd as kind of the turning point, and the numbers bear that out. The Oilers have scored more, their special teams have been significantly better, and their defense has been significantly better. And as everyday listeners of the show know, I say it often, the Oilers are built from the front back. If the Oilers are going to score their 4 goals a game and the defense doesn't need to be the difference between winning and losing, they're going to have a great opportunity most nights, because when the Oilers' high-end guys are going, and that includes Ekholm and Bouchard, they control such a significant portion of the game. That's the value of separating Draisaitl and McDavid, because when you don't play them on the same line at even strength, you're going to have upwards of 35 to 40 minutes a night with one of those 2 guys, and that doesn't include the power play time they're going to have together. You can almost get to a 43, 44 minutes a game where you're going to have at least one, if not both of those guys on the ice at the same time, if you're able to separate them. And when you think about the defense, they have yet to, I don't want to say adequately, because that's not fair, because Brett Kulak has done a reasonable job when he's been asked to play with Nurse. I would say Emberson, for what he is at this point in his career, has done a really solid job. But we know how NHL teams and we know how NHL coaches operate. They like guys who have experience. They like guys they feel like they can count on. And one of the things that teams really value is if you play a special teams role on another team, that tells the organization that's getting you that you're trustworthy, that you're dependable, that the team can count on you. And sitting here right now, this was not a necessary move. You know, this is very reminiscent of signing Corey Perry last year. This is very reminiscent of signing Evander Kane a couple seasons ago, where the Oilers, by virtue of being a Stanley Cup contender, having some cap space, are a desirable landing spot for players trying to prove it. John Klingberg signed for $1 million prorated, meaning if it were a full season contract, it would be worth $1 million. But being that he's only going to play January, February, March, and then, you know, into the playoffs, and players don't get paid in the playoffs, that cap hit doesn't count for that. He's going to get a couple $100,000 over January, February, March, and half of April. And that's it. There are bonuses which could kick in next year, which might be a problem, but it's only $300,000 they'll have to worry about for next year. So at that price point, you're telling me, best case scenario, we got a top 4 defenseman and we don't need to trade an asset to get one at the trade deadline. and we push Stetcher or Josh Brown out of the lineup entirely, and we have 7-8 guys deep now. And I talked about that on Monday with Gil Martin for the national Locked On NHL show. You want to deepen this lineup. We all know that teams are going to go through 7, 8, maybe even as many as 9 defensemen over the course of a playoff run because injuries happen. Playoff hockey puts a lot of miles on defensemen in particular because that's where we see the dump and chase game. That's where we see the cycle game. And those hits begin to accumulate, and hits that look totally fine. They just look like 2 guys coming together. They both skate away fine. A day goes by, you take your hockey equipment off and you see your knee swollen like a balloon. It looks like there's a baseball hanging off the side. Yeah, that's something that happens over the course of a playoff run. So the simple matter of the fact is, John Klingberg, once upon a time, was a very high-end offensive defenseman. You could say he was one of the better offensive defensemen in the entire NHL. Now, his defense has never been great. We know this archetype very well now. We are more than a decade into this wave of the offensively inclined right-handed defenseman. These guys are great at moving the puck. Because of their handedness, they're especially valuable because we know the ratio of righties to lefties in hockey. Lefties are more prevalent because of the way we teach hockey in certain countries. Yeah. As a brief aside, I didn't know until I was like 13 or 14 years old that in Canada, y'all teach people to put their weaker hand on the top of the stick and the stronger hand on the bottom. Wait. Yes. No, I said that wrong. Excuse me. In Canada, you guys teach people to put your strong hand on the top of the stick, the weak hand on the bottom of the stick. Down here, I was taught the other way. I was taught you put your strong hand on the bottom of the stick and you put your weak hand on the top because your wrist is controlling being able to elevate the puck. And as a kid, your writing hand is going to be stronger than your left hand. So that's the way we were taught down here. But in other countries, I'm very well aware that's why there's the lefty dominance within hockey in particular, is that in Canada, it's taught the other way. And Klingberg is right-handed, which in theory helps him play with Nurse. And if you're wondering this, if you never knew this, the reason teams like to play the left-handed defenseman on the left and right-handed defenseman on the right, they want their stick to be along the wall for the rim. So if the team is cycling in the offensive zone or there's a loose puck going up the wall, if your handedness is correct to the side you're on, all you have to do is reach. Now, if you're on the opposite side, you have to do the opposite, which is a little more disadvantageous. It's a little more awkward, and it's more likely you're going to fall or lose your balance or not be able to make a play on the puck. We're going to take one more quick break on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. We'll talk it all out. We'll talk about the range of outcomes. We'll talk about the fit and a whole lot more. So be sure to stick around. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this bonus Friday edition of Locked On Oilers. Obviously wasn't planning on doing a second episode on Friday, being that, we already did an episode. We recapped the best win of the season so far against the Avalanche. Really fun episode to do. Really got into the nitty gritty of why it was such a fun win. But when you are a good team, players want to play for you. And I know I have spent a lot of time in my 6 months, 7 months as host of this show, lambasting Ken Holland's inability to turn any developmental players into NHL regulars, chasing the shiny object in free agency, bringing in players who have baggage off the ice. And all of that said, for all of those warts, and look, you could probably say that regardless of who was in charge, that a team with McDavid, Draisaitl, and Bouchard was eventually going to figure it out. And he does get credit for some decisions, trading for Ekholm, bringing in Zach Hyman. Those are valuable, logical decisions. Those are gambles that worked out very well. Of course, you can point to some of the ones that didn't, Duncan Keith, Jack Campbell, the Darnell Nurse extension. But with all of that said, the Oilers are a credible NHL franchise. They are a desirable landing spot. And yes, it helps when you have the best players in the world on your team actively playing like the best players in the world, because guys like Klingberg, Jeff Skinner, Victor Arvidsson, they're looking around at the potential landscape and they're saying, do I want to play a lot of minutes on a bad team like the Sharks or the Blackhawks or the Ducks and get traded at the deadline and hope a contender takes pity on my soul and offers me a long-term extension after that? Or do I want to take a little bit less money? Do I want to play on a team that's going to make the playoffs? Do I want to have a chance to play a supporting role on a team that has the capacity to win the Stanley Cup? And then parlay all of that into a longer term deal, because both paths have merit. You know, you look at what Tyler Toffoli's doing with the Sharks right now, where he's having a fine season, but Toffoli was a hot commodity 2 years ago when the Flames traded him to the Devils, and then subsequently when the Devils traded him to the Jets. Yeah, he's got warts as a player. He's a pretty weak skater. If you watch his technique, I've often said he skates like Velma from Scooby-Doo runs. His release is wicked. He's got a really good shot. He's got the capacity to score 30-something goals a season. And if you play him on your first power play, you play him on your first line with your best players, he's going to put up good numbers. And you contrast that with what Adam Henrique opted to do, where there were teams like the Lightning and others that were interested in bringing Adam Henrique in and offering more money than what the Oilers were offering, or what the Oilers were able to offer. And Henrique said, I will take less money. I enjoyed my time here last year in the playoffs, the end of the regular season. I think this group has the capacity for something special. We should try and do this. That matters. That really does matter. And I do think, for what it's worth, the simple matter of the fact is the Oilers have become a desirable landing spot. And yes, it helps when you have McDavid. It helps when you have Leon Draisaitl and Bouchard and Ekholm and so on and so forth. It's easy to solve these issues when you have this much talent, but you have the inside connection, you know. And look, I don't want to make too much of this, but Klingberg played with Matthias Janmark and Corey Perry in Dallas. I think those are the types of guys, you know, I won't say fringe because they're consistently in the lineup, but bottom of the lineup players. I think if those guys are having a strong or a positive experience with your organization, even if they don't get a ton of minutes, even if they don't have a ton of responsibility, I think that still tells you that you're doing something right. You are getting buy-in to the point that if Klingberg makes that call to former teammates and says, what's it like there? Do you think I'd fit in there? Do you think this makes sense? And the guys only could say, it's been great here. I think that matters. And look, I am not expecting John Klingberg to succeed. This is a very, very low-risk decision. This is a major reconstructive surgery that requires an entirely new way to think about moving your body if you're John Klingberg, who has become a world-class athlete by doing things one way. We have seen players undergo major surgeries and not be able to adapt to what their new body can do. You know, I think my most obvious example of this is PK Subban. PK Subban, once upon a time, had one of the most dynamic skating strides of any player in the league, not just defenseman. He was great on his edges. He was never off balance, and he suffered a couple injuries. And he was used to his athleticism and his explosiveness, being able to cover up his mistakes, to be able to recover, to skate back harder. And as he got older and got slower and had some injuries, he never really figured out how he could adapt his game to his new physical limitations. Now, Klingberg has every opportunity here. The Oilers are going to want to make this work. I imagine they're going to try and ease him in as easily as possible. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw the Oilers dress 7 defensemen the first few games Klingberg gets in, just to monitor his minutes. They've done it a few times this year already for Josh Brown to be the 7th D, when they haven't wanted to play Derek Ryan or Jeff Skinner at various points. But ease Klingberg in, make sure he feels okay, make sure he recovers properly. And if there's no nagging injuries and we're only talking about player performance after a few weeks, great. But if we're managing this and he can't play every game, he can't play back-to-backs, that changes our calculus. If Klingberg can't be dependent to play in back-to-backs, if he needs a minutes restriction, if he needs a games restriction, I think the Oilers have every obligation to go out and get a top 4 defenseman. Now, I am not complaining that the Oilers chose to do this. Klingberg hasn't played good defense like ever in his career, but on the chance that there's something left in that tank and he can be a positive force on the back end, and even if he's only on the third pair, even if they do have to go out and get another defenseman anyway, and Klingberg just raises the floor of their defense and you put Stetcher into the press box, that's still a success. And the reason this doesn't matter all of that much is if this doesn't work, the Oilers can just waive him. He's not getting paid a lot of money. If no one claims him, he can go to the AHL, play out the rest of the AHL season, work out this summer, and try and ramp back up. I think the biggest thing for me in determining how this is going to go is how it feels. If he feels physically okay and has adapted to his new limitations, okay, we can evaluate him straight up on the hockey, and that's it. Of course, life isn't easy like that. I imagine, like most nagging injuries, I say sitting here with runner's knee on both of my knees. I didn't run today, I ran yesterday. I'll run tomorrow, but some days your joints feel good. Some days your joints don't. The Oilers' management of how Klingberg feels will be imperative in evaluating his performance and understanding what are reasonable expectations. If he plays a good chunk of the rest of the regular season and is in the playoff lineup regularly, I would say that's a success because all you have to do is spend cap space, and not a lot of it because it's prorated based on where they are in the season. But that'll do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers. If you could be so kind, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, throw the show a 5-star review. It's good to see the audio listeners up just a smidge. Always good when we get new people on board. It's an exciting time to be in the mix for hockey right now. We're about 2 months away, 7 weeks away from the NHL trade deadline, where things will really start to ramp up, and then it's a sprint to the finish at the playoffs. Subscribe over on YouTube. We're shooting for 2,000 by the end of the regular season. I will talk to you guys on Monday after the game against the Canucks. I will see you guys then. Everyone have a safe and fun weekend, and until then, let's go Oilers.